Okay, so I'm seeing the video feedback now. So let me know if you can hear me so that I can start the lecture. Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, so today we're going to discuss about k nearest neighbors, local learning, and the curse of dimensionality. So yeah, this is yet another classification model that you can use, and also it can be used as a regression model. And one generalization of the nearest neighbor model is the local learning approach. Okay, so um, suppose that you have a set of training samples with two labels, so binary classification -1 and 1, and you want to obtain or to produce a classification function g that estimates the corresponding weights. So this is the classification problem, and in regression we want to do the same thing, only that y instead of binary labels can be any value from R. So these are the two canonical problems that we want to address, and so far we discussed about last time. So we discussed about the learning problem, which consists of estimating or finding the function g that produces the corresponding output, about performance metrics. So for example, in regression we can use the mean squared error. We also discussed about the theoretical generalization error and the version that we can use in practice, namely the empirical error. Okay, so for the nearest neighbor model, imagine that you have some sample x in an input space, and you can also see the data points in your, let's say, a two-dimensional space, and you want to decide the label for this sample x. So intuitively, if you look at the training data that you have available, one idea that comes to our mind, and it's pretty natural, it's to use the nearest neighbor. So to look at the examples with that are closest to our data point, and to consider the corresponding labels. So this idea is used in the k nearest neighbor models, is one of the simplest models from the machine learning perspective, which means that it involves almost no training, but still, in order to obtain efficient nearest neighbor models, you have to consider adjusting the distance that you want to use, or trying to find neighbors using approximate approaches in order to obtain efficient computation during inference. So basically, the k nearest neighbor algorithm is formed of two main steps. So for a test example x, we first find the k nearest neighbors. So this means in the brute algorithm, it means that you just have to compute the distance from x with respect to each training data point. Then you sort the distances by their magnitude, and you take the examples that correspond to the smallest distances. So in the second step, Once you have the k nearest neighbors, you can apply a majority voting to obtain the label for your test sample. And yeah, a generalization of this algorithm. So instead of majority voting, you can apply a different approach. For example, a different learning model in order to obtain good results. So yeah, this is another option. Um, well, so this is actually based on local learning. So local learning means that on your local vicinity, you try to estimate the classification function with a different algorithm. But the simplest way to do it is using majority voting. The problem with majority voting is that in some cases you can have ties. So for example, if we have let's say a three nearest neighbor model, so we consider the three closest neighbors, and each of these neighbors have a different label, then we cannot select a majority vote. So we can think of different ways to try to break these ties. So this gives us the opportunity for you to interact and try to propose or to try to think of some ways to break the ties. So imagine that the three examples here have label 1, 4, and I don't know, let's say that this one is not 4, it's 2 instead. So we have labels 1, 4, and 2. And yeah, the question is, how do we select a label for X in this case? So yeah, I'm waiting for a few answers from you. Okay, one option is to take the closest one. So assuming that yeah, this one is closer to the input, we can take the label, the corresponding label. So this is one viable option, of course. We can choose one. What do you mean? Can you please detail, Andrea? We could choose a random one. Okay, so we have an answer here. Okay. We can increase k. Yeah, so you might increase it until you reach some breaking point. I'm not sure if that's a good idea. It might work. It's not one of the standard ways to do it, but yeah, if we decrease k, yeah, so we're moving towards one nearest neighbor. Could be an idea. So yeah, of course k should be odd, and yeah, k here is odd, so it can have 3, but you still can have ties. Okay, so I have some good answers. So of course one option is to choose a random label. The second option is to use a one nearest neighbor model, so just consider the closest example. And another option is just to consider all the examples, but just to use the distances as some sort of weights for the test. Sorry, some sort of weights for the training samples. Okay, so an interesting thing is that for k equal when k equals 1, actually this divides, so if you go back to this figure here, and if you consider that for every location you take you give the label corresponding to the one nearest neighbor. So for example, in this region, this is divided by a boundary between 0 and 1. So any test sample that falls closer to 0 will be labeled as 0, and any test sample closer to 1 will be labeled as 1. So this boundary goes like this until probably it reaches a point where a sample is closer to 6. So here we have a different boundary that intersects with this region. So if you try to build all these boundaries, so these are the median lines between every points, you will see that the one nearest neighbor model actually generates a Voronoi diagram over the feature space. So each cell will have a different label. So if you have your data, for example, on a binary classification task, where you want to discriminate between blue circles and red triangles as data points, you will have a decision boundary that looks like this. So of course the decision boundary can also be discontinuous, and the main idea is that the decision boundary is not linear. So it means that the k nearest neighbor model is not a linear model. Okay, so yeah. When you apply the k nearest neighbor model, this can be prone to noise in the data. So yeah, if your test sample goes into some space that is very close to a noisy label training data, you might get a wrong label for this data sample. So usually as you increase the number of neighbors up to some point, you will obtain a more general model. So just to illustrate this in an example, so we have this training data and this test data, and you can see they have roughly the same distribution. So they follow the same distribution, but still there are some intersections here between the separating borders. So when you apply a one nearest neighbor model, you obtain this border for the separation between the two classes. And of course, when you look at the test data, you will get a lot of error for these irregular regions here. So usually here we expect to have more of these blue axes instead of red circles. So as you increase k, you see that the separating border becomes smoother now. And also if you look at the error, so here the training error is 0, so this overfits the training data, but you don't obtain so good results on the test data. So as you increase k, the border becomes smoother, and you also obtain a better error rate on the test data. So the conclusion is for the nearest neighbor model, you can use the number of neighbors sort of to control or to find the optimal point between underfitting and overfitting of the model. So this is one important parameter that you need to tune with respect to your data set. Okay. Okay, so essentially the k nearest neighbor is called a memory-based classifier. So why is it called like that? It's because it doesn't do any learning. It's essentially based on just storing the training data, and then when you get a test example, you just compute the distance from the test example to every training data point. So it doesn't do any learning, it just stores the examples and then tries to sort of match them with the nearest neighbor. Okay, so here, yeah, what we have to decide for this classifier is the distance function. So this can be chosen with respect to the application. Usually in most cases for, I don't know, Euclidean spaces, we just use the Euclidean distance. But for different or more specific applications, we can use different distance functions. So another thing to consider is the number of neighbors. As you saw before, this influences the optimal trade-off between underfitting and overfitting. And also another decision is what do you do when you get the nearest neighbors. So the simplest approach is to use majority voting, and in local learning you actually can use something more complex. Yeah, so if you want to particularize this, so for example, taking a one nearest neighbor, you can choose, for example, the Euclidean distance, the number of neighbors 1, and you just predict the label of the nearest neighbor. So I think this is the most straightforward instantiation of nearest neighbor. So then you get a classification model that you can use in practice. And here are some notes on the different distances that you can use for the nearest neighbor model. So you can go, as I said before, for the Euclidean distance. So of course you assume that you want to classify vectors from a large Euclidean space. So in this example, the dimension is only 4, but still the Euclidean distance, this is just to recall on the mathematics on how to compute the Euclidean distance. Of course, in other applications, perhaps the Manhattan distance or the L1 distance might be more suitable, or you can also consider the more generic Minkowski distance, which generalizes the two distances. So yeah, Manhattan is usually defined as the L1 distance, and Euclidean is L2 distance, and the generalization is LP. So the general formula is square root of order p extracted from the absolute differences between the components in the two vectors raised to the power p. Okay, one mention here is that if p is smaller than 1, then the distance is then the metric is no longer a distance. So this can be verified for a simple case that it doesn't it violates the triangle inequality. Okay, next, so another distance. So these are quite generic distances, L1, L2, and LP. And then you can also think of distances for specific objects. So for example, if you want to apply the k nearest neighbor on text or sequence, DNA sequences, then instead of trying to find a way to represent your data in some Euclidean space, you might try to apply the nearest neighbor model in a straightforward manner. So for example, you can just select a corresponding distance that would apply to your data. So in this case, for DNA sequences, we can use the Hamming distance. So for the Hamming distance, we just compute, we just add 0 if the letters are equal, and 1 if the letters are different. So for these two sequences of DNA nucleotides, we have the Hamming distance 2. Okay, again, for DNA sequences, we can also use the edit distance, which actually is computed through dynamic programming. And this distance is given by the number of changes. And here we can define changes in different way. In the most classical approach, we use insertion, deletion, and replacement. And one particular application of this distance, so it can apply to DNA sequences, and these changes make sense to consider for DNA sequences because, for example, we can have mutations and actually all these operation, insertion, deletion, and replacement can commonly appear on DNA sequences when they replicate. So yeah, the edit distance makes a lot of sense, but another application of the edit distance is for video sequences, where since the time, so in video sequences, if you want to classify, for example, actions or gestures, people might do it with different speeds, and you would need some sort of time warping. So the equivalent for the time domain is to use dynamic time warping, which is similar to the edit distance. So actually, for the KNN model, so it's a very simple model, but it still has good applications when you have scarce training data. So one example is its application in gesture recognition. So it has some state-of-the-art results in gesture recognition with the American Sign Language on a database that doesn't have so many examples. So there are only 3 examples per class. Okay, so I'm trying to explain in more detail how to apply this model for gesture recognition. There will be some parts that are not going to be discussed. We're just trying to do the gesture recognition and not discuss about detection of the hands and other things that that are involved in this process. Okay, so the task is to recognize the gesture performed by the user, and we assume that we have 10 gesture classes. So in reality, in American Sign Language, I think you have over 1,000 classes, but here we assume a simple example, just an illustrative example to give you an idea of how the model is applied. So essentially the model is the same in both cases, only here we just assume a smaller set of classes. So it's pretty clear that the gesture are based on the hand movement. So we do not consider the shape of the hands or the position of the fingers. Okay, so I just said this before. So yeah, this is just a choice that we make for this application, and actually this choice is also valid for sign language. You can basically recognize the gestures only based on the hand movement. Of course, the accuracy can improve if you consider the shape of the gesturing hands and so on. Okay, So yeah, the gesture recognition is actually you need different modules for this part. So first, you need to figure out how the person has moved. So in this case, we can either assume that the person is fixed. So for example, the camera is in a fixed position and the user is standing on a chair. So just as I'm doing now. Otherwise, we might need a person detector and a person tracking algorithm. So yeah, we need to detect the person that is performing the gesture. So this is, for example, not so easy. I'm not sure if in these examples, yeah, you can see that there is a person doing the gesture, but if you look closely in the background, there is another person here. So if you apply a good person detection algorithm, it might detect this guy and also this guy. So the first thing that you need to do is to eliminate probably the people in the background. So just assume that the person with the largest bounding box is the one in the foreground. Okay, then, so once you figure out which is the person that's performing the gesture, then you have to detect the hand and track it over a number of frames. And also one aspect is hand shape recognition. So what we're trying to obtain here is just to recognize what the motion means. So we are not just trying to estimate the motion. So all these components are actually necessary to estimate the motion. But in the end, we want to be able to classify the gesture into one of the 10 classes. So recognizing the gesture is something different. So this is both from a human perspective and also from a machine learning perspective. So for example, if you see someone using sign language, you can probably perhaps maybe not at full speed, but in slow motion, you can figure out the motion that he's performing and you can estimate it. Although you will not recognize the gesture, so you will not know what he's talking about. Okay, so the main setup is that so you have a database of videos that are annotated with the corresponding class. So you know that in this video, this person performs the gesture for class 3, a gesture for other classes, and so on. And then you get a test video, and you need to classify this video into one of the classes. So in order to determine the gesture class, we can apply the k nearest neighbor model. And the main point of our discussion is to figure out how to measure the similarity between this gesture and the gestures in the other videos. So we will assume that the we have a hand detector. So we just have the hand location. So of course, for training videos, ideally we will need the ground truth bounding boxes annotated by people, or perhaps obtained with some marked gloves that are easy to detect, just to make sure that the ground truth doesn't contain any noise. And then at the inference time, we can just apply a hand detector. Okay, so we do not cover this part. We just assume in our application, so we're just performing the recognition and not the detection part in this application. So we assume that the hand location is known. So actually what we have as input for our recognition algorithm is the location of the hand in each frame. So for example, we have a video with 8 frames and the location of the hand goes like this, and here we have a video with 9 frames, and in each frame, so the first frame we have the hand here, in the second frame we have the hand in this location, and so on. So in both cases the gesture corresponds to the class 2, so this looks like a number 2. Yeah, so we have this trajectory. So how do we compare these trajectories? So even if the gestures are the same, of course, different people can do the same gesture in a different number of times, and they can also do it, I don't know, faster, for example, or maybe slower at the beginning and then faster at the end, or faster at the beginning and then doing slower at the end. So this is, I'm just exaggerating a bit, but yeah, you can imagine that the frames will not match identically from one user to another. So yeah, the first idea that comes to mind, you just compare the ith frame from one video with the ith frame from the other video is problematic. So for example, what happens when one video is longer? And yeah, the second idea is to perform an alignment of the two trajectories. So for example, we can match, so assuming that the gestures start in the first frame and they end at the last frame, so we can match the first two frames, and then we can try to align the frames. So for example, when we are in the upper part of digit 2, here we have 2 frames where we can align the frame 2 in this video with frames 2 and 3 in this other video. Then we can match frames 3 and 4, 4 and 5, and so on. So yeah, here, so here we have one frame that is matched with 2 frames here, and here we also have 2 frames 5 and 6 that are matched with 1 frame here. So this is kind of trying to warp the time. So for example, here we compress these 2 frames in a single frame here, and we also do it the other way around in this region. So in the end we obtain some alignment of the 2 trajectories. So the constraints are that the alignment can be many to many, as I showed in the example above. So we have 2 to 1 here, and here 1 match with 2 frames, so the alignment is many to many. So now the question is, what is the cost of this alignment? So the main idea is that when we match the trajectories, actually what we want to compute is to figure out how similar are these 2 gestures. So if we have a small cost of alignment, we assume that the gestures are pretty close. If not, then the gestures are very different. So now imagine that you want to match these 2, let's say with a 6. So the 6 will probably start in this location and go like this. So already when you match the first frame here with the first frame in a 6, these are very far apart. I mean, in the spatial location. So one good idea is to assume that the cost for matching 2 frames is the spatial distance between the location of the corresponding hand locations. So yeah, this is just an example. And now to go a bit into the details. So what are the rules of the alignment? So for example, is this alignment legal? Well, in our case, since we are working with temporal trajectories, we assume that the first frame should always be before the second, and so on. So there is some temporal coherence in the video, so we cannot match them by going back in time or going forward in time. So this kind of trajectory, this kind of alignment is not allowed in our application. So the constraints that we want to impose in our case is to add some boundaries. So actually these constraints are valid for dynamic time warping. So we want to apply dynamic time warping. So the constraints are, as I said before, we need to match the first elements and the last elements. So this is natural. The gesture starts at some point in time and ends at a later point in time. And all gesture have a starting point and an ending point. So you just match the first frames and the last frames. So that's natural. Then also what you want to have is motonicity. So in order to make sure that the alignment is monotonous, you need to make sure that you cannot go backwards with an alignment. So for example, if we have matched um, frame 3, so the hand location in frame 3 with the hand location in frame 5 here, we cannot go back and try to align 4 with frame 4 in this video. So this is not allowed. So in order to ensure that the alignment is monotonous, we impose this rule. So two consecutive pairs, so the difference has to be higher or equal to 1 between the components of two consecutive pairs. So here 4 is higher or equal to 3, but 4 is not higher or equal to 5. So this violates the monotonicity. Okay, and we also have to want to have continuity. So if we match, we want to match all the frames in the two videos. So we do not want to skip any frames because of course the gestures are continuous. There are no interruptions. Okay, so for the continuity constraint, again, we apply this rule for two consecutive frame pairs. So the difference cannot be higher than 1. So if we match 3 and 5, then we either can match 3 and 6, but we cannot go to 3 and 7, or we can match 4 and 5, but we cannot go to 5 or 5, and we can also match 4 and 6, so that's also a possible option. It's still valid for this rule. So when we put the two rules together, motonicity and continuity, we have these rules. So it means that the consecutive pair can have a difference between corresponding components of 0 or 1. Okay, so yeah, these are the constraints. So in the end, this alignment procedure gives us a distance measure. So it is demonstrated that it produces a distance measure. And the distance is actually computed using the cost of the optimal alignment between the two trajectories. So now we have, of course, different alignments possible that conform to these rules. The monotonous increase and continuity. So yeah, the idea is to choose the optimal alignment, and in order to choose this optimal alignment, of course we have to obey to the rules previously described, but we need to find it. Okay, so now going back to our application, gesture recognition. So once again, we apply the k nearest neighbor model, and now we have a method to compute the similarity between gestures. So we will use dynamic time warping. So how do we compute this distance? So let's assume that one of these trajectories is a training sample and the other is a test sample. So we want to compute the distance between these two samples. So again, the components are coordinates representing the location of the hand, like the center of the bounding box that comprises the hand. So we will use these locations, the difference between the locations, and to compute the difference between hand locations. Okay, so we have the training sample, the test sample, and we want to obtain the optimal alignment. So this is obtained using dynamic programming strategy. So here, in order to apply dynamic programming, we first break the problem into smaller problems. And we first assume that the problem has two parameters, I and j. So we try to solve the problem until components I from M and J from Q, and then we try to extend the solution to problems I plus 1 and J plus 1 and so on. Okay, so the problem the problem is defined like this. So find the optimal alignment for these sub trajectories from M and Q. Okay, so we start with the simple problems. So the problem P of 1 and J. So this problem means that M has a single frame and Q has J frames. So of course here, if we go back to the rules, the only possible alignment is M1 Q1, M1 Q2, and M1 QJ. So there is only one possible alignment here because one of our trajectories contains only one point, only one hand location. The same applies if the other trajectory, the test one, has only one location. So the optimal alignment is this one. So this is because there is only one possible alignment according to our rules. So now we have these two alignments, and now we have to solve the generic problem P, I, and J. And this is based on finding the best solution for these two problems. So going to P, I, and J minus 1, I minus 1 and J, and of course I minus 1 and J minus 1. So we find the best solutions for these problems, and then we consider the pair with the best solution from above. So we add the cost of alignment for the frames MI and QJ to the minimum of these three problems. So in pseudocode, you will have an algorithm that works like this. So you will have to store the cost of alignment for every problem P of I and J in a matrix. So we'll call this matrix C, and it will be initialized with the cost 0. And now for the first location, you add the cost between matching the first frame from the two trajectories, and then we solve for the problems P1 and Pi and 1 and problem P1 and J. Only here that the index is in, so this is assuming that the index starts with 0 as in Python. So we'll just use this notation. Okay, so now you solve for these problems with unique solution. So now you go to the generic problem, and for every problem C of I and J, you compute the cost of the current pair and add the minimum from the three problems that I mentioned before. So here you know that this is very important to go through I and j in this order from 1 to m and from 1 to n, so in not backwards or something, because you will have the solution. So the matrix looks something like this. So when you solve for this part, so you're on column 0, so you will fill in these components. When you go to this block of code, which solves the problem P1 and J, so you will fill in these cells, and then when you go to this generic solution, so you will start from the second location. So it's not, the index here is not 0, is 1, and also for j. So we'll start from here and you will fill it like this. So if you fill these cells here, when you go to try to find the optimal alignment for this location, so you have to consider the minimum of these three here. So the minimum of these three components in C are actually, for this location, are these three here. So you need to fill in the alignment for these three in order to fill for this one. And then in order to fill this one, you need these three. So you need to compute the optimal alignment to this location before computing the optimal alignment to this location. So if you start, for example, from here, you will not have all the optimal alignments that you need. So you start to fill in the matrix like this. Okay, so in the end, you will have the cost for the optimal alignment in the last cell of this matrix. And you can also, if you want to also have the alignment itself, you can go back through the matrix to find the path. So just take the minimum of this. So you start from this cell, so you know that this is the optimal alignment for your trajectories. And then you go back and look at these three cells and take the minimum. So let's say the minimum is here. So you go to this cell, look at these three cells and take the minimum, and you go to the minimum and so on. So then you go back and find the optimal alignment. So if you just need, if you don't need the optimal alignment, you just need the distance, you just take the value from the last component of this matrix. Okay, so yeah, the computational time is linear to the size of this table or quadratic to the length of the gestures M and Q. So yeah, it is a bit computational expensive to compute, considering that you have to compute this with respect to every gesture video in your training database. Okay, so this ends the case study and the example of applications of the KNN in gesture recognition. So let me just stop here and see if there are any questions. Yeah, no questions. Okay, so going on, as I said before, you can also apply the k nearest neighbor to solve regression problems. So you just consider predicting the label for the nearest data point. So for a one nearest neighbor problem, your predictions will look something like that. So yeah, the regression space is divided between different training points. So the function will look like a step function. Your prediction will look something like that. And of course, this prediction will be smoother if you use a higher k, and it will not also necessarily pass through all the data points. Okay, so the prediction here for the output is once you have the k nearest neighbor, you just compute the average prediction of your k data points, and that is the value for your test sample x. Okay, so this is just the application of k nearest neighbor um, to regression. Now about the advantages and properties of KNN. So KNN is a very simple model, so it's straightforward to use. You can even implement it from scratch. It's a nice exercise to make and to learn Python if you haven't done already. Yeah, it can be applied directly to multi-class problems. So you will see there are some methods that are designed for binary classification problems, and you need to introduce some heuristic to be able to apply them to multi-class problems. Well, for KNN this works by default, so there is no adaptation for multi-class problems required, it just works. Also, you have nonlinear decision boundary, so it can solve nonlinear classification problems. So this is yet another advantage. And also the quality of the results grows as you have more and more training data. So the model doesn't saturate if you have a lot of training samples. And mainly you have a single parameter to tune the number of neighbors, and of course you also have to choose the right distance function for you. Okay, so yeah, k can be used as a regularization method, so this is a property of KNN. So yeah, these are some disadvantages for KNN. So one disadvantage is that for some applications you really need to think of a good distance measure to use, so it's not always that the Euclidean distance is the best choice. And another disadvantage is that it has a quite high computational cost when you use the model at the test time. So essentially you need to store all the data, all the training data, and then for each test sample you need to pass through the whole training set and compute the distance between your test sample and each training sample. So this can become cumbersome if you use large training data, or if your distance function is very not so straightforward to compute, like you would use dynamic time warping, which requires dynamic programming. So imagine if you have a few thousand examples, you will need to apply dynamic programming a few thousand times. So it might not be useful for real-time applications. Okay, but anyway, there are solutions to avoid this high computational cost. So one example is to partition the feature space using KD trees. Another option is to use some hashing functions like locality sensitive hashing, which kind of maps points in the same region of your data space to a single hash in your a single cell in your hash, and yeah, it makes it easier to retrieve nearest neighbors. And yeah, another problem is that the model suffers from the curse of dimensionality. So yeah, this is related to when you increase the dimensionality of your data. So your data is represented in a higher dimensional space. Also, if you don't have enough training samples, your data is sparse, and yeah, the the certainty or the confidence of the KNN model decreases as you increase the dimensionality. Okay, so anyway, so one good option to solve so going back a bit to the curse of dimensionality, we're going to discuss more on it at the end of this lecture, but actually it's not KNN, it's not the only model that suffers from this problem. So most of the machine learning model also suffer from this same issue. So it's not only the KNN. And I think that the most specific problem is the computational time. And here we will discuss how to use approximate KNN using KD trees, which is a straightforward application. So as I said before, from one perspective, this is a simple model from a training. You don't have to do anything at training time. But here you need some strong knowledge of algorithms and data structures to apply KD trees. Or of course you can use some libraries that can do that for you. But either way, I think it's good to show you how this works. Okay, so we assume that we have these training data points that are represented in a b-dimensional space. So what we want to do is to build a KD tree on top of these data points. So in order to pick the tree, we pick a random dimension. So in our case, we have two dimensions, horizontal and vertical. So we pick this dimension first, and we consider all the data points. We compute the median, and so the median is a point that is the closest to the mean, and we add this point as a node in our KD tree, and then this node divides the space in two parts. So now for the second level of our KD tree, we take the two parts independently. We choose a different component from before. So one approach here, for example, is just to circulate through all the dimensions of your data. Or if you have a lot of dimensions, just choose dimensions randomly, or perhaps you can choose them considering their variance or number of, I don't know, components different from 0 and so on. Okay, so yeah, going back to our example, so we take these two subspaces, we choose the other dimension, and we divide them according to the corresponding median. So here we have the median 4, and for this one we have the median 6. So then we have 4 subspaces, which we again divide considering the other dimension, and so on. So now the KD tree can actually go to some level. So for example, you can use KD tree with 10 levels or something like that. It also depends on how many training data points that you have and what's the trade-off between accuracy and speed that you want to achieve. So if you really want to focus on speed, you can build the entire KD tree. But yeah, here I'm just using these 3 levels. So now For example, if we get a new test data point, so instead of computing the distance from this point to every data point in our training data, we're just trying to find the region that contains the data point. So yeah, we first take this dimension and compare it with the value in the node. So if x is smaller than 6, we go on this branch. If y is smaller than 4, we go on this branch. Then if x is higher than 3, we go on this branch, and so on. So we find the region here, and now we can consider all the points from this region. So here we have this data point, and also all the points from our path to the root to as potential nearest neighbor. So in the end, we have to compute the distance from this node, this node, this node, and so on. So yeah, we have a few potential nearest neighbors, and now we can compute the distances only to a few data points. So now if this is a binary tree, now we can reduce, for example, if this is a complete KD tree, then all the data points or all potential neighbors are on the path back to the root. So these can be at most log n. So we reduce the computation from n to log n. So imagine if you have 1000 data points, like 1024, you will just have 10 potential neighbors that you have to consider. Okay, so yeah, this definitely reduces the computation, but also it becomes an approximate solution. So yeah, the thing is, so if you look, for example, for a three nearest neighbors, perhaps, so here I think the median is not one of the 2 points, is between these 2 points. Anyway, so you can think that for example, this point here is close to this data point. So for the 3 nearest neighbors, these will be the points. But if you go, let's say, to a 5 nearest neighbor model, somewhere along the path, you will consider this neighbor, which made the split, so which is the root of this tree. So this is farther away than this training data point here. So if you just consider these data points, they will be probably close to your test data point, but they are not necessarily the nearest neighbor. So you will probably miss some of the nearest neighbors, but yeah, you will obtain some neighbors that can give you information about the label. So your method becomes approximate because of this thing, but also it will be able to compute the distance much faster. And as a trade-off, as I said, if you do not go the whole way, then you will have regions here with a lot of data points and probably your neighbors. So if your test sample is not very close to some border, then your data points will be probably in the same region, and you will find the nearest neighbors. So it's also, you can adjust the trade-off between accuracy and speed by setting a corresponding depth to your KD tree. Okay, and other possible options. So there is another idea that's called edited nearest neighbors. So this is again to try to obtain a regularized model, so to smooth out the border and to remove outliers, but also to um, to slightly increase the time. So if you reduce training samples, so for example, if you reduce this apple here or this cherry here, you will have a smoother separating border. So it can improve your generalization capacity without playing with k. Okay, and another idea is to condense the number of training samples. So once again, you can just eliminate training samples that have no effect on the decision boundary. So for example, there are some cherries here that you can remove and apples in this region and so on. So you can remove some of these data samples and reduce the number of samples that you have. So this is just another approach to improve the time. Yeah, so one approach to achieve the condensed nearest neighbor is to randomly select a set of p samples and at least one from each class, and then for each training sample that is not in p, you should add it to p if the KNN based on p classifies it incorrectly. So yeah, you select, let's say you start with a set P that contains exactly one sample from each class, and then you add more training samples which are classified incorrectly. So if a training sample is classified incorrectly, you add it to your set P. So you'll have in the end a minimum set of data samples that can correctly classify your training data. So this is the condensed nearest neighbors, and you can also combine the two approaches. So you have edited and condensed nearest neighbors, so where you eliminate outliers and reduce the number of samples. So yeah, I don't know. So this approach can reduce the number of training samples by roughly an order of magnitude, and still obtain good decision boundaries. Okay, so these are approaches to obtain more efficient k nearest neighbor models. Now, in order to improve accuracy, one idea is to employ local learning. So in local learning, for example, the main idea is that you have some data points. So actually, I think this figure refers to a global learning algorithm. So assume you have a linear classifier that tries to separate pluses from circles. So if you try to obtain an optimal separating hyperplane, and assume that you will have these two test samples, they will be labeled incorrectly. But if you apply k nearest neighbor, so you will find these points in the vicinity and then apply a linear model for this example, you will be able to separate the pluses from the circles, and you obtain a correct class for this test sample. And the same thing happens here. So this is just to illustrate why the idea of local learning might be useful in practice. So the idea is just select training samples located in the vicinity of a given test sample, then train a classifier on the selected examples. Once again, the same problems regarding the computational costs may apply here. So in order to select those training samples, you can apply KD trees or edited and condensed nearest neighbors to obtain an optimal a more efficient model. Okay, so once you select the nearest neighbors, you train a classifier on the selected samples and then apply the classifier on the respective test sample. So as in nearest neighbor, when you get a new test sample, you have to um, find the nearest neighbors each time. Here you have to do all these steps for each test sample. So yeah, this is the main idea, and we use this idea in a paper on facial expression recognition. So we combine here different neural network architectures and also a handcrafted model based on the bag of visual words, and we combined all these features into a single vector, but then instead of applying a global learning algorithm, we applied local learning and we obtain some performance improvements of 2% or 3%. Okay, so yeah, this was a short note on local learning. And now we're moving to the last part of our discussion, the curse of dimensionality. Yeah, so in machine learning, we often deal with high dimensional feature vectors. So for example, if we analyze grayscale images of 200 by 200 pixels, then our feature space has about 40,000 dimensions. And yeah, if the images are color images, so represented with R, G, and B channels, then the dimensionality grows to 120,000. Okay, so the main idea, there is a kind of a rule of thumb. It's actually called like that. So for each dimension, you would need about 5 data points to fill this one-dimensional space. So then if you want to fill the two-dimensional space, you would need about 25 data points. So 5 for every dimension. And the 3D space, you need about 125 data points. So yeah, the general rule is that for n-dimensional space, for example, r to the power of n, you need 5 to the power of n data points. Okay, so the number of data points grows exponentially. So now going back to our example, so if we want to deal with color images of 200 by 200 pixels and just linearize the images, we obtain feature vectors with 120,000 components. So in order to fill the space, we will need 5 to the power of 120,000 images. So this is a huge number. It's not possible to obtain so many images to train a model. Yeah, so just as I explained in this example, most of the times you will not have these large training sets. So most often your data will be sparse, and usually we will observe this phenomenon as as the feature space increases. Your classifier performance can increase abruptly first, so until you reach an optimal feature space that is well correlated to the number of training data samples. And if you try to continue to increase this feature space, then the performance will slowly decrease back. And this curve the classifier performance is called the Hughes phenomenon. So this is actually the curse of dimensionality. So the key idea here is that adding more features while keeping the size of the training set unchanged degrades the classifier performance. This happens after you reach the optimal number of features. So after this point, if you still want to increase the classification performance, you will also need to add more training data. Okay, so now to explain why the KNN suffers from the curse of dimensionality. So essentially, when you compute the nearest neighbors, you need to use some distance function. So for example, the Euclidean distance. But regardless of the distance function that you use, you will need to include all the components of your feature vectors. So these are, we have n components here. So imagine if we increase the space very much, then you will need to add in a lot of these components here in the distance calculation. And if this space is very sparse, you will probably not have representative data points. So then for some features, so for some indexes here, the difference might be random, because there is no close data point for the respective dimension, so you will have no representative data point. So in this case, if many of these components have random values, they will bring a lot of noise into the distance calculation, and in the end it might throw you off from finding some real nearest neighbors, and then you will not produce good predictions in the end. Yeah, so because the number of features grows for a fixed number of data samples, then the feature space becomes increasingly sparse. So this can be also illustrated through a simple example. So here we just have 1,000 data points that are sampled in the unit cube, and these are sampled in spaces from R to the power of 1, power 100, and so on until 2,500 dimensions. So yeah, this is the number of components in our feature vectors. So in each space we have 1,000 feature vectors, so we do not increase the data set size, but we just increase the dimension of the feature vectors. And then what we do after we sample these points, we just compute the average distance between every pair of points. So you can see that the average distance increases along with the dimensionality of this space. So since the average distance increases, it also means that the space becomes more and more sparse. And of course, this happens both if the points are sampled from a uniform distribution and from the normal distribution. Yeah, so the more dimensions that we have, the more data is necessary to overcome the curse of dimensionality. So for example, if the optimal number of data points for 100 dimensions will be 100, then if we want to obtain similar results, the average distance should be in the same range. So we will need to add more data points to decrease the average distance to about the same range. And this will increase our performance, but of course this is not always possible. Okay, so this was the last slide in my presentation. So yeah, I finished in time. I was afraid I wouldn't finish, so I tried to move quickly through the slides. But now if you have any questions, we still have plenty of time to answer. Okay, so let me follow this. Yeah, there is also an observation from Bogdan. Yeah, so if the data points are normalized in a hypersphere, yeah, they usually condense towards the closer to the outer layer. Yes. The data is randomly, yeah, so it's in the last slide, the data is randomly generated using uniform distribution and also Gaussian distribution. So for the uniform distribution, you have the average represented with blue, and for the Gaussian or normal distribution, you have the average represented with orange color. So the same happens regardless of the distribution of the data points. Yeah, that's the average distance on this axis, and this is the dimensionality of the space. So as you increase the dimensionality, the average increases. Okay, so yeah, let me know if you have other questions, perhaps about other slides. Also, one note here that I tried to increase the resolution of the video stream. So I'm not sure if you obtained any improvement, or do you think it's better now? So probably the resolution is higher, but also the delay is a bit is also a bit higher. So it's kind of a trade-off between the resolution and the delay. So I actually don't want a big delay when I ask questions and when you add answers. So that's why I'm trying to keep a good trade-off between the two. KNN. So yeah, of course. So yeah, in the KNN is a supervised approach. So in the supervised task, you will have a Kaggle competition. So of course you can try out KNN. It's not so actually you will have to try different approaches, perhaps also including KNN, to find how you can improve your performance. So you can definitely try out KNN for your first project. Of course, the second project is based on unsupervised learning, so KNN is not an option. So yeah, this is to answer the question about the project. If you have a data set of 100 features, what do you do then? I'm not sure I understand the question, so you need to complete to ask a complete question. So in general, you can try, I don't know, any classification model. So if you want to apply KNN as a rule of thumb, you will need, so in order to obtain optimal results, you will need 5 to the power of 100 examples in order to make sure that your accuracy is optimal. But of course, you can apply KNN even if this doesn't happen in practice. So it's still a good model to try out, even if this curse of dimensionality can affect the model. And of course, yeah, you can apply another idea if you want to reduce. So yeah, if you have a high dimensional data set and you want to apply KNN, it might be a good idea to reduce the dimension. So yeah, we will discuss about dimensionality reduction in the last part of our lectures, because it belongs to unsupervised learning. So we will not discuss it very soon, but we will discuss it at some point. So yeah, if you want to reduce the dimension, you can apply different techniques like PCA or autoencoders and so on. Yeah, it can happen in practice. So even not necessarily with neural training metrics, but even with handcrafted approaches, you can design approaches to compute the distance between objects, and you can still obtain good results in practice, even if the triangle inequality is not met. Yeah, I have a concrete example, I think, from one of my papers that I wrote a few years ago on so I think this is the published version, or maybe yeah, so for example, here we proposed a way to compute the similarity between images, and we showed some results on the MNIST database, and we compared it with nearest neighbor model with the Euclidean distance. As you can see, if you use this our approach, you can significantly improve the performance. So I think this is the number of images in your training data set, and actually I think in this paper that we don't have those results. So yeah, you can increase like almost 10% in some cases the accuracy, even if the metric doesn't respect the triangle inequality. And I think here I also have some results on the full image database, but it's also, yeah, a bit computational intensive. So here I think we are using a combined approach. So this method was not so efficient to compute, and for example here we're using we are selecting the nearest neighbors using the Euclidean distance, and then we select the 3 nearest neighbors using our metric. So for example, for this case, we select 100 neighbors using Euclidean distance, and then we select from these 100, we select the nearest neighbors using our approach. And and here, so this is the baseline, and here you obtain different improvements as you include more Euclidean, but this also increases your time. Yeah, okay, so the answer is yes, you can have that. Okay, yeah. So let's wait for a few more minutes to see if there are still other questions. Okay, so I think there aren't any more questions. So thank you guys for participating, and see you next week at the same time. And yeah, next time we will discuss about decision trees, and then we will discuss about kernel methods, and so this will be in 2 weeks from today, and then we will discuss about neural networks. Okay, so yeah, thank you, and see you next week.